Hi, this is Michael Newmans, and this is my presentation for my senior project. It's on Server 2008. It's a initial startup tutorial for Server 2008, and then the installation of a couple roles, Active Directory and DHCP. Um, Before you begin, you'll need to have two things. You'll need to have VirtualBox installed. I did everything virtually. I didn't have any physical wires or anything like that hooked up. You need to have Windows Server 2008 and Windows 7 ISO files available for your client and your server, so that uh, you can run these operating systems, and they can be found on DreamSpark, which we can use from USF. So when you start up server Server 2008, it looks like this when you start it up. This screen's going to pop up. And these are your initial configuration tasks, and you can activate Windows. We're not going to do that right now for time, but here's where you do that. Then set time zone, change time zone. Eastern time is where I am, so I hit OK. Configuring the networking. And this is our one network adapter. So when you're in VirtualBox, I should say before you started, I guess. Before you started, we have the client and the server. These are two things that we're just going to be running for this tutorial. And on both of them, under settings, under network, they need to be under internet, internal network. So basically it's like both the client and the server are connected to a switch. If they were connected physically, they're both connected to this internet so that they can talk to one another. So in our server, we're going to go here to our only network connection, go to properties. And we're not using IP version 6, so I unchecked that, and we're going to use IP version 4 when we go to properties. Initially, it's obtaining an IP address automatically. With the server, we're going to change it to use a static IP address. So we don't want our address of our server to change. So we're going to make it 192.168.0.2. And the reason I did that, before you mess with IP addresses, a lot of times you need to have an idea of what your network is going to look like. So here is the internet switch. So this is like if it was connected physically. This is what it would look like. And I have a server, and I'm going to have a client connected to it, just like this. Eventually, I want a router connected to it, and I know so that my client and my server can get out to the internet. I know that my router's IP address is 192.168.0.1, so I'm not going to use that address for my static server. I'm going to use 192.168.0.2. The default subnet mask that comes up is the class C, and the default gateway, so when I want my server and my clients or whatnot to be able to get out, or for this, I guess just my server, 192.168.0.1, which is the address of my router. So that'll be my gateway, my way out. In the preferred DNS server, I actually want my server, the one that I'm building right now, I actually want it to be the DNS server. So I'm going to change it to the same static IP address, so 192.168.0.2. And go to the network settings. And you can see our IP address is 192.168.0.2. The other thing you want to do is change your computer name. So you don't want your computer to be a random mix of numbers and letters that you don't understand. When you see it on the network, you want to be able to understand what it is. So we named it SRV1 so that it would be easily recognizable. And we don't have the domain up yet, so it's just part of a work group right now. And you can also set up automatic updating. We're not going to do that. The next thing we're going to do is start adding roles. So the role that we want to add is Active Directory Domain Services. Basically, we want Active Directory running on this server, and then promoting this server to a domain controller. So it controls everything on our network. It has access to everything in our network, so that it can control settings and stuff like that. Active Directory is like a directory service, a hierarchy sort of computers, users, all that sort of thing, an organizational tool that has many, many features. So we're going to go ahead and install that. Install. The install doesn't take too long. Once Active Directory is installed, the role, we're going to go ahead and promote this server to a domain controller so that it controls the devices on the network. And to do that, it should give us an option here once this is done installing. And there's also another way to promote it to a domain controller as well, which I'll show you in just one second. And let's see. So close this wizard and launch the Active Directory Domain Services installation to DC Promo, promoting this server to a domain controller. So if we didn't use that, we just go start, go here, DC Promo, and start this little wizard. And next. And this is our first domain, so it's going to be a new domain and new for us. It's a local domain that we're making here, so I'll just use, I guess I'll just use like my last name dot local, and so a fully qualified domain name there. Next, it's checking whether I have this domain name already in use. Since this is the first domain, it shouldn't be in use, and it's not. And the functional level, on your network, the oldest version of server you have running is what you want to pick here. And since we only have one, I'm going to choose the one we have running. And it's also going to install a DNS server role onto this server. And so we just hit next because we want that to happen. Yes. And the database folder, the log files folder, and the sysvol folder, these are the locations of these folders. Next. And make a password in case we need to access these files. It's kind of a review of what you've done. Next. And it needs to reboot after it's done this. So we're going to hit reboot on completion. So whenever this is done, it's going to reboot and all these things are going to be active. And then we'll have one more role to install, which will be DHCP. And that one is significantly faster to install than this current Active Directory. Active Directory and promoting it to a domain controller takes a lot of time and configuration behind the scenes for it to get working. So we'll wait for this to restart. Shouldn't take too long for it to start the process. And while we're waiting for that, we'll just go back to our topology here to give a better idea of what's going on. So we have our int switch here, intnet switch. So this is like a physical switch that would be connected if we were doing this physically. But since we changed the network settings, it's like this is the same thing. Then we have the server connected, and it's actually named SRV1. And the IP address is 192.168.0.2. It's the primary domain controller. It's the controller of this network that we have set up. If anyone who's a member of the domain, it has control over that. And we're going to have a client PC hooked up to it as well. And then introduce later, we're going to introduce the router, which has the IP address of 192.168.0.1. We're going to install that later so that our client and our server are able to go out and access the internet. And you can see it's still rebooting here. So the next role that we're going to install is going to be the DHCP role. And basically, any clients that are connecting to our domain are going to need an IP address. And so this client is going to connect to our domain, and then it's going to ask the server here for an IP address. And when we configure this role for the DHCP server role to be on the server, it's going to send back an IP address to this computer and any other clients that connect to our domain. So basically, we have to figure out what IP addresses we want to give out to clients that are connecting to our domain. There's a few addresses we can't use. We can't use the router's address that we're going to introduce later. We can't use the server's IP address because these are both addresses that are taken up at the moment. 192.168.0 and .255 are reserved IP addresses that can't be used. And then, say later on, if we want to introduce more, another server, a backup server, and then maybe some printers, some other devices that need static IP addresses, we want to leave some room so that we have enough addresses to statically assign them. So 192.168.0.3, the IP address after this, all the way to 49, we'll say, is going to be open for static items that we can add later on. So that's plenty of addresses for static items that want to add to our domain, to our network. So that leaves us with 192.168.0.50 all the way to 254 for our DHCP clients, so that the first one that connects is going to go back, and hopefully it's going to have 192.168.0.50, and we're going to set these settings up whenever we set up our DHCP role. It's still applying the computer settings. Hopefully it is almost finished. And it doesn't have to be 50 to 254. You could set more IP addresses. You could start it at 192.168.0.10 if you want to. But then keep in mind you would only have 7 or 8 more slots or IP addresses for static items to connect. So it's up to you, but I'm going to leave over 40 static IP addresses left in case we want to add anything to our network later. And there we go. One thing I've noticed here also is I'm not going to log in as the local user anymore. I'm logging in under the Newman's domain as an administrator. You can still access that local account on the computer by typing in the computer name and then a backslash administrator or whatever user that was. In that password, that'll access your local account, but by default it's going to say logging into the domain because we just made this domain here, so that's what we're logging into now. The initial tasks should pop up here. And the role that we want to install now, the add role, is DHCP. And I explained what that was earlier, so we're going to go through. And the static IP address is on this server, 192.168.0.2. So that's going to be giving out the IP addresses to any clients that connect. Next. The parent domain is newmans.local, that's the domain we created. And the preferred DNS server, you remember earlier we made that 192.168.0.2, which is the IP address of this server. So we're going to have that as the DNS server as well. And that DNS role was already installed. We'll hit validate, and it's valid. Next. Wins is something not really required anymore. I don't really know much about that one. And here's where we set that scope, that range of IP addresses that we want to have for DHCP clients. So to add the scope name, you just hit I'll say default scope for the name. Starting IP address, we're going to do that 192.168.0.50. and we're hoping our first DHCP client that connects will have this